What's going on, retro gaming fans, and welcome back to Rehab Gaming. So in today's episode, we're going to take this old and slightly loved on Nintendo 64 console that my buddy Matt asked me to restore for him. And also in this video, we're going to discuss the things that I like to do as preventative maintenance for these consoles so you get the best longevity out of them. So stay tuned and we'll get right at it. Now for starters, let's take a look at this console. As you can tell, it's been used and loved for many years. There's a little bit of gunk here and there. We can look down inside the cart slot, and that's going to need to be cleaned out. We're also missing the expansion pack cover, so we'll try and see if we can salvage one out of our parts drawer. We also have something that's extremely common for these consoles. We have a broken Player 1 controller port, and what normally happens when these get broken is that someone trips over the controller cord as it's plugged into the console, and over time it puts stress on the connector here, which causes it to snap. So we do actually have a replacement controller port that we're going to throw into this, in addition to the little things that we're going to do in order to get this thing back up in presentable shape and try and restore it for my buddy Matt. So before we even try and take the console apart, the first thing that we need to do is we have to remove this jumper pack here. Now, you can actually use the lid for the jumper pack to eject the jumper pack from the console, but you do run the risk of breaking it. So I like to use a little screwdriver here, try and work it up underneath this edge, lift up like so, and then you just remove the jumper pack. We also have a few screws on the underside of the console that have to be removed before we can even get the console shell separated. So this is going to be the larger security screwdriver that's also known as a game bit driver. See if I can pull mine out. Here we go. And the driver itself looks like this. So we're going to go ahead and pull out all of these screws throughout the shell of the console. I'll also take off the cover here for the, I'm trying to think of what this port is called. Well, let's just call it the external expansion port. This was for the 64 DD that was developed in Japan that never made it here to North America. So we'll go ahead and take that off, get these screws out, and let's take a look at the inside of this puppy. Now that all 6 screws are removed, we can go ahead and take off the 2 front feet. They come off like so, and you can see a little bit of dust underneath there. This one's kind of seized on there a little bit. Now with these plastic pieces, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to soak them in some warm soapy dishwater to try and get all the gunk out of the printed areas. Also, what you want to be careful of is if you'd like to break it down completely and get the cart slot doors out, just take out these 2 screws here. There are going to be a couple of springs underneath here. Just make sure that you don't lose them because they can pop out. But you see there's some dust and some cobwebs in here that we're going to need to get cleaned out. Also, if you want to remove the buttons, there's some retainer clips right here on either side. You push them in towards the center and the buttons will drop out the bottom. So we'll go ahead and put that back in for now. That's the reset button, and I believe this is the power switch here. So we're going to set this off to the side. Take a look at our main board, and as you can tell, there are years of dust and cobwebs and gunk in here that we're going to need to clean up. There are a few screws that are holding this to the bottom half of the shell that you're going to have to remove. I believe it's going to be these 2 right here for the cart connector. Also, you have some of these screws around the outside of the board. They're going to have to be taken out as well. Now, I do want you to take note that there are a couple of different types of screws in here. These longer screws up here that are this goldish bronze color are the screws that go on either side of the cart connector. You have the silver screws up here that actually hold in your AV port and your power port. So once you get all of those screws removed around the outside of the board, I believe I didn't miss any, but let's double check. You can actually lift up the board. And actually, there are a couple more screws holding this in. So it looks like you might have to undo some of these screws up here too. So we're gonna go ahead and get all of those out. Now these screws right here hold the heat sink down to the metal pads that are on top of the chips. What we will be doing is we will be replacing the thermal pads in between the heatsink plates and the chips themselves. We're also going to be doing a little bit of solder work in here where I'm going to reflow both the AV port and the power port in addition to replacing this controller port here. And the reason why that is because over time the solder joints on the AV ports and the power ports can get stressed due to thermal expansion and contraction. Also due to plugging in the console and unplugging it, it can break a solder joint after time. So I will go ahead and resolder and reflow those areas just to make sure that they're not going to pose an issue. So I did want to mention that I forgot about these two little guys up here on the expansion port. So the two screws on each side of the expansion port are actually what was causing us to not be able to lift the board out. So those have to be removed. And then I also removed these right here because I'm going to be pulling all the metal shielding off of this. So they need to be out of the way anyways. So we got them all out. And now the board lifts right up out of the bottom half of the shell. You also want to make sure that you pay attention to the bottom shielding here because that also will lift off with the board, or sometimes it'll stick with the bottom side here. And then also take note that you have these two metal pieces here. Those are retainers for some of the screws that bolt down into the console, and as you can see on either side here of this heatsink there's a hole through. Those go through to that, and then this one is actually bolted in, I believe, through that screw here. So like I said, the bottom shielding will pop off. You also have your AV port shroud. So we'll go ahead and set that off to the side. We're going to be cleaning up these metal pieces. Now, I like to use isopropyl alcohol just to prevent them from rusting. You can just use regular soap and water to clean them off, but I just use isopropyl alcohol. So we'll go ahead and set these pieces off to the side and direct our attention to the main board. So in order to get the heat sinks off, you got to make sure to get all of these screws out. Be extremely careful that when you're pulling this, that you're not going to, one, lose this little metal piece. We can actually take that off here right now since we went ahead and loosened up all the screws. But make sure you remember, or at least take a picture of, where all these pieces go, because they stack on top of one another and they only go in one way. Now that we have all of these screws taken out from this upper portion of the heatsink, we can go ahead and pull that off, and allows us access to the shielding underneath. So this shielding should just pull right off since we don't have any screws that are holding it down, at least I don't think. There we go. And just be kind of gentle with it and work it off of here. Like that. We'll go ahead and set that off to the side. So these are the three chips that we're going to want to pay attention to. Now, it was a specific request from my buddy Matt that I redo the thermal pads under here. So what I like to do is, this is a large heatsink. What you don't want to do is you don't want to try and force the plates off the top of the chip, because what you can do is you can actually pull up these itty bitty legs on your chips from the substrate. We don't want to break it, we don't want to damage it, so I like to heat it up a little bit, see if I can get the pads underneath to release, and then pull off these plates. Now you will notice that there is a little bit of oil on top of these. That's just to make sure that there is good thermal conductivity. Now what you can do is find some non-conductive oil to put on the top, back on the plates. That way you get decent thermal transference from the plates into the heat sink itself. So what I'll do is I'll grab my automotive heat gun. It gets up to about 450 degrees Fahrenheit. Try and warm this plate up so I can make the thermal pad underneath a little more malleable, see if I can break that bond, and then we'll replace the thermal pads. Alright, so we got them broke loose, and I used this little flathead screwdriver, went in between the heatsink plate here and the top of the chip, and just twisted a little bit. That way I'm not actually prying against the chip, and it just popped off fairly decent. It was fairly clean. I didn't have to heat it too much, so depending on how malleable your thermal pads are is dependent on whether or not you are going to have to even use heat at all. Now, gently going into this corner and popping it up and separating it without using heat can risk the fact that you either put a divot in the chip or something if the thermal pad is adhered decently to the chip itself. But in most cases, you should be able to pop it up with minimal heat possible, if any at all. So we'll go ahead and pull them off, and I'll show you what it looks like underneath. So there is our chip, and here is our thermal pad. What we're going to want to do is we're going to make sure that the thermal pad completely covers the entire surface here. I like to do that just to make sure that the entire chip has a significant amount of thermal conductivity between the surface of this plate and the chip. That way there's no hot spots. It's not entirely necessary to do that, but I'm a kind of a perfectionist, so what I'll do is I'll put the thermal pad on here, and then I'll cut the thermal pad out to the exact dimensions of the plate, and then I'll put the plate back on the chip and make sure everything's seated properly. Now, this point actually would be a good time to give this board a decent bath with some isopropyl alcohol and try and clean everything up before you put this on. That way you don't get any nasty debris like what's down here on the legs of this chip in between your chips and your plates. So these are actually in pretty decent shape. They're quite malleable. They seem to be holding up quite well. These are in a lot better shape than what I expected. But just for preventative maintenance, I'm going to go ahead and replace the thermal pads. Also, remember to make sure that when you're replacing the thermal pads and putting the plates back on top of the chips, you don't have any oil on top of the chips, because that will also create hot spots. So I'm going to clean all of this off with isopropyl alcohol, give us a nice clean surface to work with, and before we put these back on, we'll try and do some of the soldering and everything else that we needed to get done. Now, part of the cleaning process that I like to do is I like to take off the cart connector here on top. So all you do is wiggle and then lift up, and then I'll show you all that gunk and debris down in there. I like to clean these pins out, and also grab a toothbrush, get down in here and try and polish up the inside of the cart connector as much as possible. And then, as you can see on the other side, you have this expansion port here that's on the bottom of the console. This does not come off. Do not try and force it, because as you can see on top here, see all these little pins are connected to that, and those are soldered into place. So if you ever do need to replace it, you can desolder it and replace it. It's a little bit of a chore, but it's not that bad. However, the connector for the bottom side isn't used unless you have a 64DD, or if you're a developer or a modder and you want to try and use the capabilities of that as a pass-through into the console from something else like an emulator, then you want to make sure that that's still intact. Now, most of this board has actually been scrubbed up and should be fine, but what I like to do is I like to spray a little bit of extra isopropyl alcohol on here. I'm using, I believe it's either 90 or 99% technical grade isopropyl, and I'll grab a Q-tip here and I'll get into the small little nooks and crannies to get most of this gunk out that I couldn't reach with a toothbrush. I do want you to be aware that if you're using a cotton swab like this, you will leave minute traces of some of the cotton around on the board. So just be mindful of that if you're going to go over an area that you plan on doing some solder work on that could pose an issue, and you just want to make sure that you get all of that cleaned up off the board. So this is from the areas that the toothbrush bristles was unable to get to. That's why it's always a good idea to kind of go around with the cotton swab and just get up in those little nooks and crannies that you can't reach. Now, with the expansion pack slot, what I like to do is I like to take my isopropyl, spray it down in there, be very generous about it, and then I'll take my toothbrush here and just very gently get it inside and try and polish up those pins. Knock some of that dirt and gunk loose. Make sure you don't push too hard because you don't want to bend the pins on the inside of this connector. After you're confident that you've cleaned almost all of the gunk out of there and that you've knocked loose any debris that might have dropped in there over the years, I like to go back through with another rinse of alcohol just to wash that out to the bottom of the connector. Now, another thing that I like to do too is just give it a general spray all over the board at an angle so that the alcohol can rinse off any additional gunk and residue that's on here, so you have the cleanest surface to work with possible. Now that the board is mostly clean, I also like to look around these surface mount electrolytic capacitors before I spray everything down, just to see if I can see pools of electrolytic fluid indicating that some of these capacitors are leaking. Now, fun fact, because of how these capacitors are designed, I've noticed over the past few years of many devices that I've worked on that the surface mount electrolytic capacitors have a tendency to leak more often, more frequently, more consistently than through-hole capacitors. Normally the through-hole capacitors, or also THT capacitors, leak after the electrolytic fluid inside starts to either one, evaporate, or two, the components overheat causing the electrolytic fluid to evaporate, or they start venting because of internal resistance or what have you. These seem to leak a little more consistently just based on the design, and you can tell because there'll be a little pool of some like brown juice gunk around the capacitor, and it'll just look like maybe some used flux that wasn't ever cleaned up off the board. But the telltale sign is if you see any oxidation on the connections for the surface mount capacitors. Now, what that'll look like is, I'll try and zoom you in here as best as I can. There we go. Now, I'm going to draw your attention to this capacitor up here. You see how that solder joint is nice and shiny. That is normally indicative of a factory solder joint that has been properly wetted and that the capacitor is not leaking. Now, if you find a solder joint that is pretty much looks like aluminum, it's not shiny, it's extremely dull, it looks a little porous, that's going to be a good indication that electrolytic fluid is leaking out of that capacitor. You can also see some green on the board from it eating away at traces. You'll also see a little bit of bubbling in the solder mask. You can also notice that some of the connections on like chips like this aren't shiny, and every component around whatever the leaking capacitor seems to be just a little questionable. So just keep an eye on that. Normally what I would do if I'm going to do a full restoration of one of these consoles, I'll replace every single one of these. Since it seems like this specific console is not having that problem currently, I'm not going to worry about doing that right now. And I'll just have my buddy Matt keep an eye on everything. If his console seems like it's behaving a little weird, I'll have him bring it back, and we'll try and order some of these replacement surface mount capacitors and then just swap them all out. So this is going to be the bottom side of the board. As you can see, this is the external expansion slot. Right up here you have your AV multi-out, and then over here you have your main power connector, and then right down here we have where the controllers are soldered to the board, or excuse me, the controller ports are soldered to the board. This is going to be the one that we're going to be replacing, so we're going to be focusing on this here. I'm going to reflow these joints with some fresh solder and flux. I'm also going to reflow this side over here just as preventative maintenance, and then I'll reflow both the power jack connections and the multi-out connections over here. Now that we went ahead and reflowed the multi-out port and the power port, we're going to draw our attention to the 3 and 4 player controller port over here. Now this is not going to be removed from the board. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to reflow these joints to make sure that they are strong enough to hold up to the many years of abuse that they might actually endure. And then after we get done with reflowing that, we'll come over here to the 1 and 2 player controller port. We'll desolder all of these pins, replace that port with one that is not broken, and then we'll try and get everything all back together again, starting with the thermal pads that need to be applied onto the heatsink blocks. And so the same principle applies for anything that you wanted to solder. You want to go ahead and saturate the area in flux, introduce some new solder into the mix. That way you can make sure that your joints are wetting properly and that the old solder isn't making it difficult to remove the item from the board. Also make sure that you watch out for all of these small surface mount components up above the controller port. You see how this pin is having difficulties heating up? Adding new solder into that helps that process to make sure that thermal transference will actually make it all the way through the pin and the pad so you can get it off the board. Now what I'll do is I'll clean off my soldering tip, and I'm going to come in with some desoldering braid. Now I use a slightly smaller piece of desoldering braid, smaller width actually, and the reason why I do that is because what I can do is I can expand out the width of the soldering wick and open up the fibers so that it's easier to get solder up into the braid. So this is going to be the wick that I use. You see how I flared it out at the end here? That helps make sure that I have enough surface area to suck, that makes sure I have enough surface area to suck all of that solder up into, and also you use less solder braid this way. Alright, so I went ahead and cut off that used portion. I'm going to coat my desoldering braid in flux so that the solder will wick. Come in with my soldering iron. Always make sure to clean off the tip of your iron every single time that you plan on soldering, and then also right before you put it back. It's just a good habit to get into. That way you can make sure that your soldering iron tip will work properly. So we'll get around on all sides of the joint. Make sure we wick up all the solder out of this joint. Also be careful because you can burn yourself. And also solder your desoldering braid to your board. Alright, so that one looks fairly clear. We'll go ahead and move on to the next one, and we'll just do that right down the line. So I got all the holes cleaned out, got the new controller port mounted in here, and all we have left to do is to go ahead and flow some new solder into these joints to make it permanent. So now that we have that controller port replaced, it is now time to take our heat sink blocks and to put some of this thermal padding on it. So what I'm using is a 100mm by 100mm by 0.5mm thickness thermal pad, and it'll come with plastic on both sides. So what I'm going to do in order to get a thermal pad to match the size of the heatsink base, let me get this cleaned off, is I'm going to lift up one of the sides of the thermal pad. I'm going to take your heatsink base here, put it down, and I'm going to cut around it with an X-Acto knife so I can get a fairly decent size pad that is going to roughly be the shape of the block, and it will be pretty much spot on for what I need to put on the console. And now here's what we're left with. So what I did is one of these sides is thicker than the other. This right here is an extremely thick piece of plastic, and I lifted that up, put the square on, cut out around it, and then I took my X-Acto knife and I cut all the edges around this heatsink block, and it left the thin plastic side to protect it until we're ready to install. So we're going to go ahead and do that to the rest of the heatsink blocks, like this one here and this one here. So we'll just lay it on top, we'll cut it out with the X-Acto knife, and then we'll go ahead and trim around the edges like we did the first one. So now we have the thermal pads attached to our blocks. We're going to go ahead and reattach them to the chips. Now you can see there's a little bit of residue there. I try to wipe these chips down as best as possible, used isopropyl alcohol and a Q-tip, and that's about as good as it's going to get. Now I want you to pay attention to these two chips right here, because the smaller thermal block is rectangular in shape. And you got to make sure you pay attention that you put it on the right way, because that almost looks good, but if you notice, it doesn't exactly cover all of the chip's surface. So if you flip it the other way, you'll notice that that actually does cover the entire surface of the chips. So you want to make sure that you get these blocks on there in their proper orientation, and to double check that, you can actually grab this right here, lay it down, and make sure that your holes line up. And if they don't, spin it, see the proper orientation, and now your mounting holes line up. So the easiest way to do this is to mount them on the chips and then double check to make sure that the holes line up. Some people will actually leave the blocks mounted to this heat sink here, but I find that more difficult to try and align the chips up properly with the heat sink blocks, because you really can't see the edges of the chips, and you can't tell if you're 100% on the chip or not, or if it's cockeyed or cattywampus or what have you. So I'm going to go ahead and affix the blocks to the chips, and then we'll get back to trying to get all this put back together. So I have all of the blocks in place, and I've been using the heat shield as a guide just to make sure that they all line up properly. Now, I'm not going to push all of these down until everything is completely assembled, and I'm going to let the pressure, let me zoom you out here. And now that we're zoomed out, I'm going to show you that these screws right here that hold this part of the shielding on actually compresses down on this, and it'll provide pressure on top of the blocks. Now here's another thing that you can do. It's not entirely required, but I like to do it myself, is before you put all of that on, in order to increase the thermal conductivity of these blocks to the shield, to the heat sink and everything else, is go ahead and take a little bit of thermal compound and coat that area. For example, I use this right here. I use the Arctic MX2, and I'll put it on here, just a little blob right in the center. It's just going to be enough to make sure that I get decent thermal transference from the blocks to the shielding and the heat sink and everything else. So I went ahead and put some thermal compound on between the shield and those aluminum blocks that's actually attached to the chip using that thermal pad. And then I also used thermal compound on the backhand side of here. What I did is I put a little dot in between the 4 screw posts, and I went ahead and put the heat sink on top of that, And then I wanted to show you how these go back in, because it's really easy to kind of get confused. These are little metal brackets, excuse me, and they are specifically to support your expansion slot connector right here. So this one goes in first. You got to be very careful to make sure that it actually goes into the connector and slides down like that, to where the metal pieces go into the plastic right here for these two wings for the bolts, and that you actually get them straight down in there to where this completely mates up with the heatsink here, and then mates up with the board down here. Now if you have everything in position like it should be, you should be able to get this piece right here clipped down in, and you'll see the edges kind of slip down into the plastic. It'll want to spring up a little bit because it keeps this under tension, and then as you saw, this kind of rotated a little bit. That's because of the thermal compound. And then you have this piece right here. This piece goes back in this area, push down, and that supports this right here. So now what we need to do is we need to grab all the screws and throw them back in where they're supposed to go. And as soon as we get everything screwed down, especially the board and the cart connector screwed down, and then we get this heat sink here screwed down to the board, it's actually going to sandwich the thermal pad down to the top of those aluminum blocks that are on top of the chips, and it's just going to hold everything together. And it's also going to squeeze out any excess thermal compound between the shield and those blocks and the heat sink and the shield. Alrighty, so here's a fun factoid for you. There is a spot down here for the LED lens, and the lens itself has a habit of running away. So make sure that before you get everything screwed back together, that little guy is tucked down in there. And unfortunately, I didn't notice it until I was putting in these two screws, so I went ahead and had to take out all the other screws that I put in. And fun fact, all of the screws that you see missing here, with the exception from these right here, those are the only ones that you need to get your board completely out of the shell. These only hold together the shielding and the heatsink components to the board, and then all together to itself. So all you need to really do is lift up the front of your board, set it back off to the side, and make sure this little guy goes back down in there like it's supposed to. And there you have it. Now we have everything put back together. So now you know what you should probably consider doing if you want to make sure that your Nintendo 64 console is gonna last and be reliable. Now, because of this cart slot here has doors that open and it's not covered all the time, it is very easy for gunk to get up in there. So if you're having issues with your Nintendo 64 console not reading games, it's probably because that sucker right there is dirty. If you're having issues with your console not powering on properly, it might be your power jack in the back of the console. If you're having issues getting video or audio, or it's intermittent, you can check either one, that your cord is actually working properly and doesn't have any breaks in the conductors, or two, you can check to see if your multi-out over here has a broken solder joint on the main board. Now, the power switch in and of itself can be an issue sometimes. The only thing that you really need to do in order to try and fix the power switch is squirt a little bit of IPA down inside the switch itself, work it a little bit, make sure you clean the contacts on the inside, make sure you wash it out with some additional isopropyl alcohol, and also make sure that everything dries before you power it back on. So that takes care of this project. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please hit that like button down below. Also, please check out all of our other videos that we have posted on our channel. So without further ado, thank you for stopping by, and we hope you have a wonderful day.